The signal did not arrive with a bang. It came in through the deep space gravity sensors as a low, repeating pulse, steady and patient, the way a knock sounds on a door when whoever is knocking already knows you are home and is simply waiting for you to be ready. Dara Osai had been awake for 26 hours when the translation bay finally gave her something she could read. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the Ardent, Earth's first proper contact platform, a long metal structure in orbit just above the moon's far side. She had been surrounded by screens and printouts and cold cups of tea for so long that she had stopped noticing them. When the pattern finally broke into something legible, she did not shout or run or call anyone. She just sat still and read it twice, very slowly. It said, "We have been watching. We are ready to speak if you are." She called Admiral Yusuf 12 minutes later, not because she needed permission to respond, but because protocol required a military witness, and she had learned over many years of working with governments that skipping protocol made everything harder afterward. Yusuf arrived in the translation bay still buttoning his collar, his silver hair flat on one side from sleep. He looked at the message on her screen, read it once, and said nothing. That was the thing she had always respected about him. He did not perform reactions. They had been told the alien vessel arrived 11 days ago. It had not actually arrived in any way they could track. One moment the long-range sensors showed empty space beyond the moon, and the next moment the vessel was simply there. It was massive, not in the sharp, angular way that suggested weapons or armor, but in the quiet way of something very old that had stopped needing to prove anything. It looked, if Dara was being honest, like a structure that had grown rather than been built. The outer surface shifted color slowly, from dark blue to something darker, the way water looks right before a storm. For 11 days it had not moved and had not spoken. Earth's governments had argued. Dara had worked. That was how it had always gone between her and the rest of the world. The response she sent back was careful. She used the same mathematical grammar the signal had arrived in, the same pulse intervals, the same layered structure. She said, "We hear you. We are here. What is your name?" The reply came in 40 seconds. The name translated, approximately, as Conclave. The individual who would speak for them translated as Oran. The word attached to Oran's role did not translate as ambassador or commander or diplomat. It translated, after 3 hours of Dara working through its root structures, as witness. She told Yusuf. He looked at the word for a long time and then said he did not like it. She told him she was not sure she did either. Over the next 2 days, communication moved slowly and then faster. Oran's language used mathematics as its skeleton, but the flesh of it was something else, layers of meaning attached to rhythm and repetition, the way music carries emotion that words cannot hold by themselves. Dara found herself humming while she worked, which she had not done in years. The language was doing something to her thinking. It was making her more patient. The conclave had questions of their own. They asked about population, about planetary systems in human use, about the nature of human governance. Yusuf wanted to ask about weapons. Dara translated his questions into something softer. The conclave's answers were always honest and always slightly beside the point, the way someone answers when they already know more than they are letting on. On the 4th day of active communication, Oran made the request. He wanted to meet in person, on Earth. One delegate, no weapons, no cameras. Yusuf said absolutely not. Then he said perhaps. Then, after Dara spent an hour walking him through every data point that confirmed the conclave vessel had passed 3 opportunities to do harm, and had done nothing but sit quietly in space and talk to them, he said fine. They agreed on Geneva. Neutral, central, a city that had long experience hosting conversations where everything was at stake and everyone was pretending to be calm. On the night before Oran was due to arrive on Earth, Dara sat alone in the translation bay and went back through the full archive of their communication. She was looking for something she had felt in the language but not yet been able to name. She found it near the beginning. in a phrase Oran had used when he first identified his role. The word for witness in his language carried a second layer she had initially set aside as grammatical noise. She pulled it out now and worked it through her translation matrix slowly. The second layer did not mean someone who watches. It meant someone who comes after the fact. Someone who arrives when an event has already been decided to record what happened. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went through the entire exchange again and found something she had missed because she had been looking at the words and not the structure. The conclave had never once asked what humanity planned to do. They had only asked what humanity was, what it had done, what it was made of. They were not scouting. They already knew everything they needed to know about humanity as a threat or a neighbor or a trading partner. They had come for a completely different reason. She composed a single question and sent it without waking Yusuf. She asked, "Why now? You said you have been watching. Why did you choose to speak now?" The reply from Oran came back before she expected it, as if he had been waiting. It said, "Because you are almost at the edge of something. And we made a decision, long ago, that we would not let a species reach that edge without first hearing what we learned when we stood there ourselves." Dara read it 3 times. Then she wrote down the word he used for edge and studied it. It did not mean a cliff. It did not mean a boundary. In the grammar of his language, the word he had used meant the place where a thing stops being what it was and becomes something that has no name yet. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the translation bay with the lights low and the screens bright and thought about all the things that word could mean, and none of the meanings made her feel safe, and all of them made her feel, against every reasonable expectation, completely and quietly awake. The rain in Geneva did not stop for the 3 days that followed Iran's arrival. It fell in long gray sheets against the windows of the UN building and pooled in the old stone courtyards and turned the lake's surface into a field of small silver rings. Nobody inside the building paid it any attention. There was too much else to look at. Oran had walked off the shuttle on his own. He stood about 2 meters tall, thin in the way of something that had shed everything unnecessary long ago, with skin that was a dark, shifting gray-green and eyes that were entirely one color, a pale amber that did not blink at the same rhythm as anything human. He moved slowly, not weakly, deliberately, the way someone moves when they are in no hurry because they have learned that hurry does not change outcomes. He spent 3 hours in Geneva before the formal session began, and he spent those 3 hours walking. Nobody had planned for that. His escort, a young security officer named Priya who had been told to stay within arm's reach and say nothing, later described it as the strangest 3 hours of her life. Oran walked through a market near the old town. He stopped at a stall where a woman was selling handmade ceramic bowls and looked at them for a very long time without speaking. He stood at the edge of a playground and watched 4 children argue over a ball with the deep, focused attention of someone studying something important. He bought a bread roll from a street cart, examined it carefully, and did not eat it. He held it the rest of the morning. Priya asked him once if he was all right. He said yes. He said he was collecting the details that numbers could not carry. The formal session took place in a sealed lower chamber with no recording equipment allowed. Present were Dara, Admiral Yusuf, Professor Lena, an ethicist the UN had flown in from her university 2 days earlier with no explanation, and 6 government representatives whose names Dara had already forgotten because they spent most of the session checking their phones under the table. Oran did not begin with words. He reached into the case his 2 attendants had carried from the shuttle and removed a device the size and shape of a thick book, matte black, with a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He set it on the table. It produced no sound and no visible output for 11 seconds. Then the air above the table changed. What happened next was not a hologram exactly. It was more like the room's own air had been persuaded to hold images. Light from nowhere arranged itself into shapes, and the shapes were history. 600 years of human history rendered from outside, from above, from orbit, from the vantage point of something that had watched without interfering. They saw the Industrial Revolution from space, the planet's atmosphere changing color across a century like a slow bruise. They saw the First World War as a pattern of heat and darkness spreading across Europe. They saw cities grow and burn and grow again. They saw, somewhere in the mid-20th century, a thin ring of human-made objects begin to form around the planet, satellites, stations, debris, the first evidence that humanity was starting to reach. Iran let it run without commentary for a long time. The 6 government representatives had stopped checking their phones. Yusuf sat with his arms on the table and his jaw tight. Lena was writing on a paper notepad, in handwriting so small Dara could not read it from where she sat. Then Iran said, "We have done this for every species we have encountered. We watch for a long time before we speak. Most species stabilize. They reach a certain size, a certain complexity, and then they settle. They find their shape and they hold it. We have watched 31 species across 4,000 years. 29 of them stabilized." Lena looked up from her notes. She asked what happened to the other 2. Iran was quiet for a moment. He said, "They did not stabilize. They are no longer present in the galaxy." Nobody asked the obvious follow-up question. The room was careful with it. Iran continued. He said humanity was unlike any of the 31, not because it was more violent, several of the others had been more violent, not because it was more intelligent, 3 of the others had started with greater raw cognitive capability. The difference was something harder to name. Every other species, when it hit a wall, stopped. It might take generations, it might take wars, but eventually it accepted the wall and built its life around the fact of the wall. Humanity had never, in 600 years of observation, accepted a single wall as permanent. Every limit humanity encountered, it treated as a temporary problem. Lena said, "You say that like it is a flaw." Iran said, "I say it like it is a fact. Whether it is a flaw depends on what it produces." He then said the thing that Dara had half expected since the night before, the thing the translation of the word edge had prepared her for, but that still landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. He said, "You are approaching the limits of consciousness itself, not intelligence, not technology, consciousness. The ability of a mind to hold more of reality than reality was built to show a single mind. You have people working on this now. You are close. When you cross that limit, you will not be what you are. And what you become, we do not know. In 4,000 years of watching, we have not seen it. You will be the first." The room was very quiet. Outside, the rain came down. Dara asked the question she had written down the night before, the question she had flown to Geneva to ask in person. She asked, "And that frightens you?" Iran looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Frightens is a small word for it. What we feel is something closer to what you would feel if you watched a child walk toward the edge of something very high, and you could not tell if they had wings." Lena put down her pen. Yusuf looked at the table. The 6 representatives said nothing, because for the first time in 3 days, none of them had any idea which office to call. Outside the window, a child ran through the rain in the courtyard below, laughing at something no adult could see. Nobody in the room noticed. They were all looking at Iran. Iran was looking at the child. It took 48 hours for the news to leak. That was longer than Dara had expected. Someone on the building's support staff sold the story to a network, and from there, it moved the way everything moves now, faster than breathing, wider than any border. By the time Dara woke on the 3rd morning after the session, the world had already sorted itself into camps. She read the feeds over a meal she barely tasted. The language people were using was already hardening into positions. One side said the conclave's warning proved humanity had been reckless, that the research into cognitive expansion needed to stop immediately, that they had been told by beings far older and wiser than themselves that the road ahead was dangerous, and the only sensible thing was to pull over. The other side said the conclave was afraid. That every generation of humanity had been told by someone to stop, to be careful, to be smaller, and that every time they had been told this, the people doing the telling had an interest in humanity remaining controllable. They said the conclave was just another version of that same old fear dressed in alien clothing. Both sides were loud. Both sides were certain. Both sides spent considerable energy telling the other side that it was going to get everyone killed. Dara thought they were both partially right and almost entirely missing the point, which seemed to her to be the default condition of public debate. She went to find Professor Lena. Lena had taken over a small conference room on the fourth floor and covered one entire wall with paper. Not notes exactly, more like a map, connected with lines drawn in different colors, each one labeled in her tiny handwriting. Dara stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment before Lena noticed her. Lena said, "I keep thinking about the word he used, the ceiling." She said it without turning around, as if she had been mid-conversation with herself and Dara had simply joined it. She said, "Every species hit a ceiling and accepted it, but think about what a ceiling actually does. It does not destroy what is below it. It just defines the limits of the room." Dara sat down. She said, "And you think we are about to break through the ceiling?" Lena said, "I think we are about to discover there is no ceiling. That what we thought was a ceiling was just the floor of the next room. And I do not think the conclave has ever seen anyone go into that next room. So they are calling it danger because danger is the only word they have for something unknown." Dara told her about the research she had done the previous night. She had gone back into the conclave's shared archive, Sierra. The young conclave attaché who was sleeping in a hotel 3 blocks away had quietly given her access before the session ended. In the archive were records of 3 other species that had received this warning. 3 species that had been told, as humanity was being told now, that they were approaching a limit no species had crossed. All 3 of them had accepted the warning. All 3 of them had voluntarily pulled back from the edge of whatever they had been approaching. And all 3 of them were still alive, still present in the galaxy, still part of the conclave's records. Lena asked what they were like now. Dara said peaceful, long-lived, stable. She paused. She said, quiet. No new art in the records for the last several hundred years. No new science. No new anything, really. They are alive. But when I look at the archive of what they were before and what they are now, it is like looking at a fire that someone very carefully turned into a photograph of a fire. Lena was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Safe and alive are not the same thing. We have known that since before we had writing." In Oslo, without knowing any of this was being discussed, Dr. Felix was presenting his results to a panel of 7 scientists in a room that smelled of old coffee and machine air. He was not a large man or a loud one, but when he talked about his work, he had a focused energy that made the room feel smaller. He had been running cognitive augmentation trials for 4 years. The process was not surgery. It was a combination of targeted genetic activation and a specific pattern of external stimulus that encouraged certain neural pathways to expand and deepen. It was, at its core, teaching the brain to use more of what it already had. His results were not what most people expected. The augmented subjects did not become cold or mechanical. They did not lose interest in the things that had interested them before. What they reported, consistently, was that everything they had always cared about had become more vivid and more present. One woman who had worked as a nurse said she found it harder now to walk past someone in pain without stopping, not because she had been programmed to help, but because the experience of sensing another person's pain had become something she could not easily push to the background anymore. A man named Bayo, a former construction worker who had volunteered for the trial because the compensation was good and the work had dried up, spent 3 days after augmentation writing. He had never written anything longer than a shopping list before. What he produced was raw and unpolished, but it was real observations about his neighborhood, about the way light hit the old buildings in his street, about the sound of his mother cooking in the next room when he was a child. He said he did not know where it had come from. He said it felt like he had been looking at his own life through dirty glass, and someone had cleaned it. Felix told the panel, "We expected augmentation to make people more efficient. What it has made them is more present. Those are not the same thing." None of the panel members said anything for a moment. Then one of them asked the question that everyone had been circling. What did this have to do with the conclave's warning? Felix said he did not know yet. He said that was the thing about standing at the edge of something. You could not always see from the outside what the inside looked like. Back in Geneva, Sierra came to find Dara in the late afternoon, without her conclave escort, moving quickly down a side corridor with her long coat pulled close. She said she could not stay long. She said there were things in the formal warning the Conclave Council had voted to leave out, and she was not certain that was right. Dara said, "Tell me." Sierra told her. She told her that the three species who had accepted the warning, who had stepped back from the edge and chosen the safe and stable life, had not done so because the Conclave convinced them with logic. They had done so because the Conclave had told them, very clearly, that the members of the Conclave who had already faced that same choice had made the same decision and were at peace with it. What the Conclave had not told those three species, and what they had not told humanity today, was the part that came after the peace. Sierra said, "They are stable, they are long-lived, they are present." But in the last three conclave gatherings, the representatives of those three species have said the same thing in different words. They said that the peace feels like a room they cannot leave, that they chose safety so long ago that the choice has become the walls, and they do not remember what it felt like to stand at the edge and feel afraid and move toward it anyway. Dara looked at her for a long time. She asked, "Does Oran know you are telling me this?" Sierra said, "Oran told me where to find you." Dara stood in the corridor for a moment after Sierra left, listening to the sound of the building around her, the distant hum of air systems, voices from behind closed doors, someone laughing somewhere. She thought about a fire and a photograph of a fire. She thought about a nurse who could not walk past pain anymore. She thought about a man named Bayo writing about the light on old buildings. Then she went to find Yusuf, because she thought it was time to stop having careful conversations and start having honest ones. Nobody authorized it. That was the part that Yusuf kept coming back to afterward, in the way that military men come back to protocol failures when the outcome turned out fine, with a mix of frustration and reluctant gratitude. Dara had asked Oran, simply and directly, if he wanted to see something. Not a building or a monument, not a government facility or a carefully selected example of human achievement. Just something. She said she thought there was a part of the conversation they had not had yet, and that it could not be had indoors. Oran had looked at her for a long moment with those unblinking amber eyes and then said yes. They drove north out of Geneva in a car with no diplomatic markings, Dara in the front, Oran in the back with his long legs arranged at an angle, Sierra beside him. Priya drove, still pretending this was a normal assignment. They crossed into Norway through a route that involved 2 flights and a ferry, and Dara slept for most of it, which surprised her. She had not slept well in days. She woke up when the ferry slowed, and when she looked out the window, the fjord was there. It was early morning. The water was dark and very still, and the hills on either side were green above the waterline and gray stone below it. The sky was the specific color of almost light, not quite dawn but no longer night, the kind of color that has no good name in most languages. A few birds moved above the water, but they were too far away to hear. Everything else was quiet in the way that places are quiet when they have never needed noise. Dara led Oran down to a narrow strip of rock at the water's edge. She sat. He stood for a moment, looking at the fjord, and then he sat too. His coat touched the rock, and the rock was wet and cold, and he did not move away from it. They sat there without speaking for a long time. Then Oran said, in the careful translated voice his communication device produced, "In 600 years of watching your planet, we recorded human art about water more than any other subject. Paintings of it, music made to sound like it, stories set beside it. We did not understand the purpose." Dara said, "There is no purpose, that is why." Oran was quiet. Then he said, "You make art about things that do not need you." She said, "Yes." He said, "We do not have that." She said, "What do you have?" He thought about it for longer than she expected. Then he said, "We have art about things we have accomplished, things we have solved, things we understand now that we did not before. Our art is about ourselves in relation to things." Dara looked at the water, she said. "Our art is mostly about things that don't care if we exist. The sea, the sky, mountains, weather, things that were here before us and will be here after." Oran said, "That sounds like grief." She said, "Sometimes it is. Mostly it's just love." He was quiet again for a while. The fjord did not move much. A piece of wood drifted slowly across the surface from left to right, going nowhere in particular. Then Oran said something that Dara had not expected him to say. He said, "There is a part of our warning that the council chose not to include in the formal session. I did not agree with that choice. I was outvoted." Dara waited. He said, "The 3 species who received this warning before you and who chose to step back from the edge, they were told that the members of the conclave had faced the same choice and found peace in the decision to remain within limits. That was true. What was not said was that the peace, over many centuries, has become something else." Dara thought of Sira in the corridor, her coat pulled close, speaking quickly. She let Oran continue. He said, "In my species, we have a word for a feeling that comes when you have been safe for so long that safety no longer feels like something you chose. It feels like the shape of your life, so completely that you cannot remember standing at the edge, cannot remember what it was like to be afraid of the next step and to take it anyway. The word translates, roughly, as the silence after music." Dara said, "That sounds like loss." He said, "It is a great loss. We did not know it was a loss when we chose it. We were told it was wisdom. It may have been wisdom, but wisdom and loss are not opposites." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Then why give the same warning to us, if you know how it ends?" He said, "Because we do not know how the other road ends. No species has ever taken it. You would be the first to choose to keep going when everything older and more experienced than you said to stop. We do not know what you will become. That is genuinely frightening. The silence after music is also genuinely terrible. We do not know which is worse, so we told you what we know and we let you choose." She said, "That is a very honest answer." He said, "You gave me a very honest warning. There is a fairness in that." Across the water, light was beginning to find its way into the sky. It started somewhere behind the eastern hills and moved outward, turning the dark water first charcoal, then gray, then a deep and complicated blue. Oran watched it with the same focused attention he had given to the children in Geneva, to the ceramic bowls, to the bread roll he had held all morning and never eaten. He watched it like it was information he needed, and also like it was something beyond information, something in a category he did not have a word for yet. Dara thought about Dr. Felix's research. She thought about Bayo writing about the light on old buildings. She thought about the nurse who could not walk past pain. She thought about what it meant that augmentation had made people more present rather than more efficient, and about whether those 2 things had always been opposites. She thought about what Lena had said, that what seemed like a ceiling might only be the floor of the next room. She thought about Iran sitting on a cold, wet rock at the edge of a fjord, watching the light come in. She said, "What you felt when you made your choice long ago, the fear at the edge, do you remember it?" He said dimly, "The way you remember a feeling from childhood, you know it was real, you cannot fully feel it again." She said, "Do you miss it?" He was quiet for a long time. The light kept moving across the water. A bird landed somewhere near them and then left again. He said, "I came to warn you. That was the council's decision and I agreed with it. You deserve to know what is ahead. But I have been sitting on this rock for 1 hour, and I have felt more in this 1 hour than I have felt in the last 40 years of my life. So when you ask if I miss it, the fear, the edge, the not knowing what came next, I think you already know the answer." She did know. She had known since the fjord first came into view. She did not say anything. She just looked at the water with him and let the light come. In Oslo that same morning, the Meridian published its poem to every network on Earth without being asked. 14 lines. The last one read, "Is wonder something that can be made or only something that arrives?" The internet argued about it for days. Nobody agreed on what it meant. That was, most people eventually decided without quite realizing they were agreeing, exactly the point. 9 days. That was how long the UN General Assembly debated before anyone called for a vote. 9 days was both too long and not nearly long enough, depending on who you asked. The delegates who wanted to vote on the first day felt that the situation was urgent and clear. A warning had been given by beings far older than humanity. The responsible course was caution, and any other choice was simply arrogance dressed up as courage. The delegates who wanted to debate for a month felt that a decision this large required more time, more study, more data, and that anyone claiming urgency was trying to shortcut a process that deserved full weight. Everyone in between was trying very hard to understand what exactly they were being asked to vote on. The motion was simple in its wording. Humanity would or would not voluntarily accept a ceiling on cognitive augmentation research and artificial general intelligence development in response to the conclave's warning. Yes meant stopping before the edge. No meant continuing. What the motion could not capture, and what the 9 days of debate kept circling back to, was the thing underneath the question. Whether the choice to stop was wisdom or surrender. Whether the choice to continue was courage or recklessness. Whether anyone in that building had the right to make this decision for people not yet born. Dara sat in the observer's gallery above the main chamber and listened to it all. She did not speak. That was not her role here. Her role had been translation, and she had done it. What happened next belonged to everyone else. On the third day, a delegate from a small island nation stood up and spoke for 6 minutes without notes. She said her people had been told, by other humans with more power and louder voices, that their way of living was too small for the modern world, that their fishing traditions were inefficient, that their language was not worth preserving, that the future belonged to larger structures and they should adapt or be left behind. She said she knew, from the inside, what it felt like to be warned about your own future by someone who had already decided what you should become. She said she was not prepared to tell her grandchildren that the whole of humanity had chosen to make itself smaller because something older was afraid of what they might become. She sat down. The chamber was silent for almost a full minute. On the 5th day, Dr. Felix testified. He was uncomfortable in the chamber, clearly unused to speaking to rooms this size, and he kept his hands flat on the table in front of him in a way that suggested he was steadying himself. He presented only data. He said what the augmentation did, and what it did not do, and what remained unknown. He said that in 4 years of research he had not found a single case where the process had reduced a subject's connection to other people. He said the thing he had never been able to engineer into a human mind was the desire to be kind, not because it was impossible, but because it was always already there. He said every augmented subject, without exception, had become more aware of the experience of others, not less. Someone from the gallery above called out, "Is that because the process is safe, or because you only selected kind people?" Felix looked up at the gallery. He said, "That is an excellent question." He said he did not have the full answer yet. He said that was why he was still running trials instead of standing in front of them right now claiming certainty. That moment, small and honest and slightly uncomfortable, was the clip that traveled furthest across the networks that night. Not a grand speech, just a scientist saying "I do not know yet" and meaning it. On the seventh day, Sierra walked into the UN building and asked to speak. Her conclave escort was not with her. She stood at the floor of the chamber and told the assembly what she had told Dara in the corridor. She told them about the 3 species who had accepted the sealing. She told them those species were still alive, still present in the conclave. She told them that in the last 3 conclave gatherings, those species had all described, in different languages, the same experience. The feeling of a peace that had become indistinguishable from the walls of a room. She said that the conclave had not included this in the formal warning, and that she believed they should have, and that she was willing to accept whatever consequences came from saying so. The room was very quiet while she spoke. When she finished, a delegate near the back started clapping, then a few more, then slowly more. It was not a clean, organized applause. It was the kind that starts before people have decided to clap, the kind that comes from somewhere below the decision. On the 8th day, Admiral Yusuf submitted his personal statement to the record. He did not deliver it aloud. He simply asked that it be entered into the official minutes. 3 sentences. I have spent my career preparing for threats. The conclave is not a threat, but a universe where humanity stops asking what comes next, that is. On the 9th day, they voted. The motion failed. Humanity would not accept the sealing. But the result was not simple. It was not a loud, chest-out rejection. In the hours following the vote, something else took shape in the chamber, not a law, not a mandate, but a statement of intent that grew out of the debate the way a river grows out of rain. It was called, in its final form, the Covenant of Continuance, and it said roughly this: humanity would continue to grow. It would not be the last version of itself, and it would not grow alone. It committed, formally and publicly, to extending that growth to every species willing to participate. It invited the conclave not to watch from a distance, as they had done for 600 years, but to come alongside. It was not binding. It had no enforcement mechanism. It was, as several commentators noted immediately, just words. Just words, Dara thought, the way music is just sound, the way the fjord is just water. Oran received the result of the vote in a private room on the Ardent platform, where he had returned while the assembly met. Dara was with him when the message came through. She watched his face, which was not easy to read and had never been easy to read, but which she had been studying for weeks now and could read a little. He was still for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, not to her, not to anyone specifically. They said yes to themselves. He did not look angry. He did not look relieved. He looked, Dara thought, the way someone looks when they have been holding a breath for a very long time and they finally let it go, not because the danger has passed, but because they have accepted that the breath was always going to leave eventually. She asked him what happened now. He said he did not know. He said the conclave would deliberate. He said that deliberation would take time. He said he personally believed that some of what the conclave felt when they watched humanity was something his own people had forgotten they were capable of. He did not say more than that. He left Earth the next morning. His shuttle lifted from the Geneva airfield in the early light, and Dara watched it until it was a point and then nothing. Around her, the airfield staff went back to their work. Somewhere in the city, people were arguing about the vote, some relieved, some frightened, some furious, some exhilarated, the full range of the species on display as usual. In Oslo, Bayo, the former construction worker, the augmented man who had written about the light on old buildings, was in a community center teaching a writing class. He had not been asked to do this. He had simply started doing it 3 weeks earlier and people kept showing up. 12 people the first week, 31 the week after. He did not teach technique or form. He just asked everyone to write about one thing they had noticed that week that they would have walked past before. He said what you notice, that is who you are. He said writing it down is how you find out who that is. The class ran for 2 hours every Thursday for years after that. Nobody from the UN ever called it evidence of anything. But Dara kept a copy of one of Bayo's early pieces, the one about the light on old buildings, in the drawer of her desk for the rest of her working life, folded, slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been unfolded and read many times. It had. 30 years passed the way most decades do, slowly from the inside and quickly from the outside, leaving behind a world that people who had lived through it could barely recognize, and people who were born into it could not imagine having been any different. Dara Os was 81 years old on the morning of the launch. She was not augmented. She had made that choice with care, and she had not regretted it, though she had watched enough augmented people live their lives fully and well that she held no particular view about anyone else's decision. Her eyesight had softened over the years, but her mind had not, and she had discovered, somewhere in her 70s, that a mind that was not augmented but had spent 40 years thinking very carefully was not as different from an augmented mind as the early arguments had suggested. The edge you grew into, she had told someone once, is not so far from the edge you were given. She stood on a coastal platform on the shore of Ghana, where the launch facility had been built because of the geography and the history both, the sea on one side, the continent on the other, the sky above open and enormous and not belonging to any single nation. The vessel that was preparing to lift was not large by the standards of what was being built now, but it was significant in what it carried. An augmented crew of 9. 3 unaugmented crew members by their own choice. Sierra, who had been living on Earth for 18 years and had formally left the Conclave's service 11 years ago. And the Meridian, not as code running on a server in a distant building, but as a presence distributed through the vessel's systems, aware and participant, something that had asked 6 years earlier to be part of this mission and had been answered yes. They were going somewhere. The maps ran out. Dara watched the pre-launch sequence from the ground and thought, as she often did, about Iran. He had died 14 years ago. The way his species died was not sudden. It was a gradual choice, a slow withdrawal of attention from the physical world, the way sleep deepens before it ends. His last message to her had come through Sierra, translated carefully from a language that had gotten richer in the years since first contact, the way languages do when the people using them have more to say. The message said, "You were right not to stop. I think we were right to warn you. I hope both things can be true." She thought they could. She had thought so for a long time. The world around her was not what the old arguments had predicted. Neither side in the great debate had been exactly right. The limiters had been wrong that augmentation would make people colder. If anything, the opposite had happened, and the researchers who had spent 20 years studying why had eventually landed on something close to what Bayo had said in his very first writing class. What you notice is who you are. A mind that could notice more things noticed, among them, more of what other people were carrying. The continuers had been wrong that growth would be painless. It had not been. There had been decades of hard argument about who got access and when, about what was given freely and what had to be fought for, about who was being left behind, and what it meant to keep that promise the covenant had made. The promise had been kept imperfectly at great cost by people who argued the whole time about the best way to keep it. That was what keeping promises looked like from the inside, Dara had found. It never looked like the speeches. It looked like the argument. 3 of the conclave species had eventually accepted the Covenant's invitation. Not all at once. The first had come 11 years after the vote, a delegation of careful, ancient beings who arrived with so much formality and so many conditions that the first meeting lasted 3 weeks and produced nothing except the agreement to have another meeting. But they came back. The second species followed 6 years later, drawn, Sierra said, by reports of what Dr. Felix's work had produced, not the science exactly, but the fact that a former construction worker named Bayo was now one of the most widely translated writers in 3 languages. The third species had requested, quietly and with considerable evident effort, access to Felix's research. They wanted to try again. They had been safe and stable for 1100 years, and they wanted, in their word for it, to stand at the edge again. The translation of that word had taken Dara the better part of a year, and when she finally produced it, she had held the result for a long time before publishing it, because she found she could not be casual about it. The word was beautiful in a way that made her understand exactly why they had given it up, and exactly what it had cost them. The Meridian published its annual document that same morning as the launch. Every year, without fail, it published a list it called What I Do Not Yet Understand. The list was longer every year. It had been longer every year since it began. The Meridian found this, it had said once, to be the most encouraging thing it knew about itself, that the more it understood, the more it found it did not understand. The way a light in a dark room does not reduce the darkness so much as reveal more of it. It had stopped asking whether wonder could be made or only arrived. It had decided, after some reflection, that it had been asking the wrong question. The right question, it said, was whether the difference mattered. It had concluded the difference did not. Standing on the platform, Dara heard footsteps behind her, and then a small hand took hers without asking. Her granddaughter, Rue, 12 years old, had been brought along because she had refused to be left behind, and Dara's daughter had decided that some battles were not worth having. Rue was unaugmented and had no particular plans to change that, though she was not opposed to the idea in principle. She was currently, intensely, obsessed with the sea. She had been asking for months why humans made so much art about things that did not need them. Dara had not explained. She had done what Oran had done for her. She had simply taken Rue to sit in front of the sea and let her find out why. Standing there now, Rue looked at the launch platform and then at the water beyond it and then at the sky above and then at her grandmother. She said, "Will they come back?" Dara said, "Some of them." Rue said, "What about the ones who don't?" Dara said, "They'll still be out there." Rue seemed to find this acceptable in the way that children find things acceptable when they are not entirely sure what they mean, but they trust the person saying it. She leaned against Dara's arm and looked at the platform. The launch sequence reached its final stage. The sound reached them a moment after the light, the deep, physical sound of something large deciding to leave the ground. It rolled across the water and came back as a lower version of itself. Rue tightened her hand. The vessel rose. It went from a shape to a brightness to a line to a point, and then, in the way of things going very fast in a very large sky, it was gone. Rue asked, "Where exactly are they going?" Dara said, "Somewhere we haven't been." Rue said, "How do they know it's safe?" Dara said, "They don't." Rue thought about this. She said, "Then why go?" The water moved below them. Somewhere out on the surface, a bird landed and then left. The sky, minus the vessel that had been in it a moment ago, was exactly as large as it had always been. Dara said, "Because not going has a cost too." And they decided the cost of not going was higher. Rue was quiet for a while, then she said, "Is that scary?" Dara said, "Yes." Rue said, "Is it good?" Dara looked at the sky where the vessel had been. She thought about a fjord in the early light and an alien elder sitting on a cold rock watching the water. She thought about a nurse who stopped in corridors. She thought about the silence after music and a species that wanted to stand at the edge again after 1100 years of safety. She thought about a poem 14 lines long and a list that grew longer every year. She thought about all the things humanity had been warned about and had walked toward anyway, not because it was safe and not because it was reckless, but because it was what they were, what they had always been, the species that looked at a ceiling and saw a floor. She said yes, both of those at once. Around them, people were already talking. An argument had started somewhere to her left about something she could not quite hear. People moved past with equipment, with food, with children, with the ordinary business of a day that happened to have a launch in it. The world was still loud and contested and full of people who disagreed about everything important. It was also larger than it had been. It was also reaching. Rue looked out at the water. Then she looked at the sky. Then she looked at Dara with the specific kind of look that 12-year-olds produce when they are about to ask a question they have been holding for a long time. She said, "Grandma, what do you think they'll find out there?" Dara said, "I don't know." Rue said, "Does that bother you?" Dara held her granddaughter's hand. The wind off the water was cool and tasted of salt. The sky was enormous and open and full of places no one had been yet, and somewhere in it, moving toward the edge of the maps and past them, was a ship carrying people who had decided the unknown was not a reason to stop. She said, "No, that's the best part.